gender equality is one of the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals. The United Nations says there has been progress over the last decades, but the world is not on track to achieve gender equality by 2030. The UN also says commitment and bold action are needed to accelerate progress, including through the promotion of laws, policies, budgets, and institutions that advance gender equality. Greater investment in gender statistics is also vital, since less than half of the data required to monitor Goal 5 are currently unavailable. Now, Nigeria has work to do, quite a ways to go in terms of gender inclusion. Nigeria ranks 123rd out of 146 countries on the Global Gender Index, according to the World Economic Forum, indicating the need for coordinated efforts to address gender inequality-related gaps. Now, in 2022, the Nigerian Economic Summit Group's Policy Innovation Center, PIC, held a Gender and Inclusion Summit. The summit convened government, business, development, civil societies, and academia leaders who would deliberate on transformative ways, deliberate policies to achieve gender equality and accelerate the actualization of these sustainable development goals, as well as shared prosperity for men and women. The plan for this is to be an annual event. Joining us from our Abuja studio, Dr. Osasuyi Dirisu, who is Executive Director, Policy Innovation Center of the NESG. Doctor, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. So, I mean, we've seen the rankings for Nigeria, from the World Economic Forum. How would you assess the Nigerian environment in terms of gender mainstreaming?
Thank you so much. Well, I'll start by saying that the awareness has increased. So people are getting aware of the need to drive and work in an environment that promotes gender equality. So that is good. Everywhere we go, we're talking about gender. I think the challenge is gender is still seen as the icing on the cake as opposed to the cake itself. So we see programs and policies that were not designed with gender considerations from start, but just as you want to deploy because you want to conform with international standards or tick the boxes, then we sprinkle some gender considerations on top. So what we'd like to see more is gender being right at the center of conversations, not at the end, but right at the beginning of program design. When we begin to think about a policy or a program or a project or workplace and policies, then you think about gender equality, equity, and social justice as central considerations. I think that's the next step that we need to take as a country. The gaps are huge. The gender equality gaps are huge. Inequalities are huge. So we also need to consider those gaps, how to bridge those gaps when we are reflecting on program or policy design. If we continue to make gender, the considerations at the end, then we're never going to bridge this gap.
All right. There's the business environment, even in the realm of politics. The United Nations had an observation of our last elections in March. And one of the observations they made was a very low participation of women, low female participation in elections. So what is holding Nigeria back from, as far as, undermining efforts to close that gap, from the business environment to even political participation? What is the problem?
Yeah, there are many problems. I would start with the elephant in the room. So we live in a patriarchal society. And the perception about women taking leadership roles is still very, very, very low. The thinking is that women should still be subjugates, and women should contribute at the backstage. I just want to mention here that contrary to what we all think, women actually participate in the electoral processes. The only challenge is that they're invisible participants. Women drive community engagement. Women drive support electoral parties. So women do a lot of background work, but a lot more agency, a lot more capacity, a lot more peer learning, a lot more enabling environments is needed for women to become more mainstream participants, taking the front seat as opposed to sitting at the back. So we need a policy enabling environment. But it's not just enough to say, okay, we have a policy that guarantees that women should at least be 35%. We now need to think about what are the barriers, what are the financial barriers. It's very expensive to actively participate in politics in Nigeria. What are the socio-cultural barriers? How are women going to break those stereotypes that limit them from coming out to make bold statements about the fact that they have the potential and the competence to lead? So going forward, we need to do a lot more to make commitments to actually create an enabling environment for women to participate without fear of their safety or security, or fear of being pushed to the backstage, or even fear of being harassed in the process of doing so.
Can you tell your summits? You've had your Maiden summit last year, the Policy Innovation Center's Gender Summit. What can you tell the takeaways from there? Any improvements or impact that we've seen since then? Can you talk about the summit?
Thank you. So the summit was, I see the summit, 2022 summit, which was the very first of its kind. I see that was an opportunity for us to start the conversation. And thankfully, we started the conversation in November 2022. We are not stopping there. So we created awareness. A lot of people who came for the summit were very surprised to see that these real issues that we discussed around, inclusion, bringing everyone together, bridging the gaps, new and innovative ways of advancing equality and women empowerment. So we had those conversations. Now, where we want to go with these conversations is begin to think around how to move from voices. So we had our voices. We aired our voices in November. We now want to move to action. And that's why we're reflecting on launching the Purple Book, which is the book that contains the program and policy recommendations from the summit. We don't want those recommendations to go to waste. So we want to begin to amplify the voices from the Gender and Inclusion Summit 2022 to ensure that we can begin to work closely with stakeholders and policymakers to implement those little action points that can lead to massive changes in our gender equality profile as a country.
So what's in the book? I think you're going to be launching that Purple Book, I think, the 16th of this month.
Yes.
So what are the specifics? You're talking about actions, so that's what we really do want to get to here. What's in there?
Yes, so what we have done is we've put all the conversations together, and then we've looked at the evidence around some of the challenges and the barriers. We don't want to just keep talking about problems, so we've looked at the problems, and then we have sat down to look at what the evidence is around simple, practical solutions at national, state level, at the level of development partners. So we've broken down our recommendations to federal, state, development partners, civil society, private organizations. So putting those recommendations in a way that very easy to read book. Anyone who picks it up can see what those recommendations are and run with them.
Now, as far as your summits, I mean, going beyond the book now, how do we measure the impact? I mean, as far as, do we have to wait for another, for instance, global index ranking from the World Economic Forum? What metrics are we going to use between now and your next summits, using the extracts from the book? How do we know we've made progress?
Thank you. So what we're going to do, we have our own indicators in-house. So what we want to do is, as we disseminate the book, we are in touch. We have a database of stakeholders who have been in touch with us asking for the book, but also stakeholders who attended the summit. And we're working in those spaces to ensure that we can begin to see who is using the evidence and what sort of impacts. I mean, we've gotten testimonials since the last summit, but we're taking that further to see who needs to use the evidence, tracking what they used it for, and we want to celebrate some of those success stories when we have the next summit this year in November. So directly celebrating success stories from the last gender summit.
So wait, is the book going to be sold, or are you going to give it out free at schools and businesses and government agencies? What was the plan with the book?
Thank you so much. It's a Gender and Inclusion Summit. And in order to be inclusive, we would make sure the book is free. So immediately after the launch next week, We would share the QR code on all our platforms. The book will be free to download. People can request copies of the book. People can also request to have, further conversations to discuss, some of their lessons or learnings from the book and how that is informing the work they do going forward. So the book is free.
Okay, well, that's good. Now, okay, so there's stakeholders on one side. What about you at the PIC? What steps will you be taking to ensure that the recommendations in the book are not only curated, but also implemented?
Yes, so as an organization, we also do run gender programs. So we are using the learnings, first of all, as an organization at the Policy Innovation Center. But also, like I said, because we're working with a wide range of stakeholders, we do trainings, we provide technical support. So we already have a lot of platforms on ground to ensure that we're able to support stakeholders who and we're doing that already, but who want to have conversations about specific learnings from the Gender Summit and from the book.
All right, now so the summit, that's your Gender Inclusion Summit now. We understand it's been institutionalized as a yearly event. So what do we expect from the next summit? And, again, what we'll be pointing to as improvements that we can measure from the last one, from the Maiden one to the next one.
Thank you. So the next summit is going to be over 2 days because the first summit was 1 day and it was a tightly packed full day. So we have a lot more happening this year. We're going to have a lot more opportunities for organizations across the country and even some from other parts of Africa to disseminate gender-focused success stories, learnings from gender works they've done, what has worked and what hasn't worked. And then we're going to have an opportunity for a day 2 where we can now have political conversations around policies, programs, and approaches for mainstreaming gender both in government, private organizations, and in development agencies. So it's a 2-day fully packed Gender and Inclusion Summit this year. And we'll be unveiling the theme for this year's summit next week.
All right. Well, we hope Nigeria, moves up on the index as far as the global gender index, and we hope to see other metrics as well. But we thank you for your efforts, and we thank you for joining us to talk to us, Dr. Osasuyi Dirisu, who is of course Executive Director of Policy Innovation Center at the NESG. You're watching.